The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Toronto as Keanu Reeves pulled his jacket closer against the autumn chill. He had returned to his hometown for the International Film Festival, but today he wanted something different, a quiet walk through the old neighborhood where he'd spent part of his childhood. Away from the cameras and the red carpets, Keanu blended in surprisingly well. With his baseball cap pulled low and his unshaven face, he looked like any other person enjoying a morning stroll. That's how he liked it. Fame had never changed his down-to-earth nature. As he turned the corner onto Gerrard Street, memories flooded back. The park where he played hockey with friends. The corner store where he bought candy with pocket change. The old brick school building where he'd struggled with reading due to his dyslexia. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. New shops had replaced old ones, and condos stood where family homes once were. But something about the place still felt like home. Feeling thirsty, Keanu stepped into a small convenience store. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The place smelled of coffee and newsprint. Behind the counter, an elderly woman was arranging lottery tickets in their display case. Something about her seemed familiar, the way she carefully lined up each ticket, her patient movements. "Just a water, please," Keanu said, approaching the counter. The woman looked up and smiled. Her face was lined with wrinkles, and her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun. Her blue eyes have a sparkle to them, despite the tired circles underneath. "Of course, dear," she said, turning to the refrigerator behind her. Her movements were slow, a bit stiff, as if her joints pained her. Keanu studied her face. There was something about those eyes, that voice. A memory stirred, buried beneath 35 years of life. "Do I know you?" he asked gently. The woman turned, water bottle in hand. "I don't think so," she said, but then paused. "Though you do look familiar." "I grew up around here," Keanu offered. "Went to school just down the block." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Wellington Elementary." Keanu nodded. "I taught there for nearly 30 years," she said, placing the water on the counter. "Fourth grade mostly." And suddenly it clicked. "Mrs. Harrison?" Keanu asked, his voice rising with surprise. "Jennifer Harrison." The woman's eyes widened. She leaned forward slightly, studying his face. "Yes, that's me." "How did you?" Recognition slowly dawned on her face. "Little Keanu. Keanu Reeves?" Keanu broke into a warm smile. "Yes, ma'am. 1985. Room 22. Mrs. Harrison's hand flew to her mouth. "My goodness. Look at you. All grown up," and she suddenly seemed embarrassed. "Well, everyone knows who you are now." "I'm just me," Keanu said with his characteristic humility. "But you, what are you doing here?" "Working at a convenience store." A shadow crossed Mrs. Harrison's face. She straightened slightly. "Life takes unexpected turns, dear. I'm just grateful to have work." She glanced at her watch. "My shift ends in 10 minutes if you'd like to catch up." Keanu nodded eagerly. As Mrs. Harrison helped another customer, he noticed things he hadn't before. The worn sweater she wore despite the store's warmth, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she winced when reaching for items on high shelves. They sat on a bench outside the store, trading stories. Mrs. Harrison had taught for 40 years before retiring. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago. She spoke proudly of former students who had become doctors, teachers, and artists. What she didn't say, but what Keanu gathered from her careful words, was that something had gone terribly wrong with her retirement. She mentioned housing difficulties and medical expenses in passing. "I'm staying with a friend temporarily," she said, looking away, "just until things sort themselves out." When Keanu asked for her phone number so they could meet again, he noticed her hesitation before explaining she couldn't afford a cell phone anymore. She wrote down her friend's number instead. As they parted ways, Keanu watched his former teacher walk slowly down the street, her shoulders slightly stooped but her head held high. The woman who had once patiently helped him sound out difficult words now couldn't afford a place of her own. Something shifted inside him. He needed to know more. He needed to help. Keanu couldn't sleep that night. The image of Mrs. Harrison working behind that convenience store counter kept playing in his mind. He remembered how she'd stayed after school to help him with reading, how she'd never lost patience even when he got frustrated. Now she was struggling just to get by. The next morning, he called his old friend Mike, who had never left Toronto and knew everyone in the neighborhood. "Mike, do you remember Mrs. Harrison from 4th grade?" Keanu asked as soon as Mike answered. "The one with the blue-rimmed glasses who made us write poems every Friday? Yeah, of course. Why?" "I ran into her yesterday. She's working at a convenience store and something seems wrong." Mike went quiet for a moment. "I heard about that. It's pretty sad, actually. Her husband Bob died from cancer about 5 years ago. The medical bills were huge." Keanu frowned. "But wouldn't she have a teacher's pension?" "That's the really awful part," Mike explained. "The pension fund for her school district got caught in some big financial mess. A bunch of retired teachers lost almost everything. There was a story in the local paper about it last year." Keanu's stomach tightened. "How bad is it for her?" "Bad. My mom ran into her at the food bank a few months ago. She's too proud to ask for help, but Mom said she's living in this tiny apartment over on Carlton Street. The building should probably be condemned." Keanu thanked Mike and hung up, then made another call to his local driver, Dave. "I need to see something, but without attracting attention," he explained. An hour later, Dave drove Keanu past a run-down 3-story building with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The front steps were cracked, and several windows were patched with cardboard. "That's it," Dave said quietly. "Apartment 2B is hers, according to your friend." Keanu stared at the building, a heaviness settling in his chest. This was where the woman who had shaped his early education, who had shown him that his dyslexia wasn't a dead end, was living. Later that afternoon, Keanu visited the community center mentioned in the note Mrs. Harrison had given him with her friend's phone number. The center director, a woman named Patricia, lit up when he asked about Mrs. Harrison. "Jenny?" "Oh, she's our angel," Patricia said. "Comes in 3 times a week to help with our literacy program. Works with the kids whose parents don't speak English. Won't take a penny for it either, though God knows she could use it." "How long has she been volunteering here?" Keanu asked. "Going on 15 years now. Even after everything that happened, she never missed a session. The kids adore her." Patricia showed him a bulletin board covered with thank you letters from children and families. In the center was a faded photo of Mrs. Harrison surrounded by smiling kids, each holding up books. "Last month we had a pipe burst," Patricia continued. "Water everywhere. Jenny showed up in rubber boots with a mop and worked all day alongside the cleanup crew. Then I found out she walked here because she couldn't afford the bus fare." Keanu swallowed hard. "Does she talk about her situation?" Patricia shook her head. "Never complains. But Rose at the front desk told me Jenny's been skipping meals to afford her heart medication, and that apartment she's in, there's black mold, barely any heat. The landlord knows she can't afford to move, so he doesn't fix anything." That evening, Keanu sat in his hotel room making calls to his financial advisor, to his lawyer, to a real estate agent in Toronto. On his laptop, he pulled up news articles about the pension scandal. Photos showed elderly former teachers protesting outside government buildings, holding signs that read 40 years of service betrayed. He spotted Mrs. Harrison in the background of one photo, her face determined despite everything. Beside his laptop, he placed his own 4th grade report card that he'd kept all these years. Mrs. Harrison's handwritten comments stood out. "Keanu shows extraordinary kindness and determination. When he sets his mind to something, nothing stops him." He picked up his phone and made one more call. "I need to set up a foundation," he told his lawyer. "And I need it done quietly." The next afternoon, Keanu stood outside Mrs. Harrison's apartment building, a small paper bag of pastries in his hand. He'd called her friend's number that morning, asking if he could stop by. His stomach nodded as he climbed the crumbling front steps. Inside, the hallway smelled of mildew and old cooking. A flickering light cast shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Keanu walked up to the 2nd floor, his footsteps echoing on the bare wooden stairs. At apartment 2B, he paused before knocking. From inside, he could hear classical music playing softly. 3 gentle knocks, and the music stopped. "Who is it?" Mrs. Harrison called. "It's Keanu, Mrs. Harrison." The door opened slowly. Mrs. Harrison stood there in a faded blue sweater and gray slacks, looking surprised. "Keanu, I wasn't expecting you until later." "I hope it's okay that I'm early," he said. Of course. Come in." She stepped back, suddenly looking embarrassed about her home. The apartment was tiny, just one main room with a kitchenette in the corner and a door that presumably led to a bathroom. The furnishings were sparse: a small table with 2 chairs, a one couch, and bookshelves made of boards and concrete blocks. But everything was meticulously clean, and the windows sparkled despite the gray day outside. "I brought some pastries," Keanu said, offering the bag. "How thoughtful." Mrs. Harrison took the bag. "I just made tea. Would you like some?" Keanu nodded, noticing how she subtly moved to block his view of the kitchen, but not before he saw the bucket catching water from a leaking pipe, the hot plate that served as her stove. "Your place has a nice feel to it," he said, meaning it despite everything. The walls were covered with children's drawings and thank you notes. Bookshelves held well-worn classics. Mrs. Harrison laughed softly. "No need to be polite, Keanu. It's not much, but it's home for now." As she prepared the tea, Keanu noticed her shiver. The apartment was cold, the ancient radiator in the corner silent. "Is your heat working?" he asked. "Not since last week," she said matter-of-factly. "The landlord says the part is on order. I have a space heater for the really cold nights." They sat at the small table, steam rising from the chipped mugs. Mrs. Harrison's eyes brightened as she asked about his life, his career. Not once did she mention her own troubles. "I'd followed your work, you know," she said. "That librarian character you played. He reminded me of my late husband. Same quiet strength." "I wish I could have met him," Keanu said. Mrs. Harrison smiled sadly. "Bob would have liked you." She rose slowly and went to a small wooden box on the bookshelf. "I kept something all these years. Thought you might get a kick out of it." She handed him a yellowed paper, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Keanu recognized his own childish handwriting immediately. A creative writing assignment from 4th grade. The story was about a boy who found a magic paintbrush that made his drawings come to life. "You were the only teacher who didn't get frustrated with my dyslexia," Keanu said quietly. "You stayed after school to help me sound out words." "You were worth every minute," she said firmly. "Such imagination, such heart. You just needed a little extra time." A droplet of water fell from the ceiling, landing on the table between them. Then another. Mrs. Harrison quickly moved their teacups. "Just a little leak," she said, grabbing a pot from under the sink. "Happens when it rains." Keanu looked up at the water stain spreading across the ceiling. Another drop fell, this time landing on the protected story. Without thinking, he moved it to safety. "Does the landlord know about this?" he asked, his voice tight. "He knows about all of it," Mrs. Harrison said with a sigh. "The mold in the bathroom, the broken heater, the leaks. But fixing things costs money, and there are no empty apartments in my price range." She straightened her shoulders, clearly embarrassed. "I'm sorry about all this. I didn't want you to see." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "Well, it doesn't matter. Tell me more about your travels. I've always wanted to see Rome." Keanu couldn't focus on small talk anymore. The injustice of it all, this woman who had shaped countless young minds, reduced to living like this, filled him with a quiet determination. "Mrs. Harrison," he said gently, "I'd like to help." Mrs. Harrison's face changed when Keanu offered to help. Her back straightened, and a flash of pride crossed her eyes. "That's very kind, but I'm managing just fine," she said, lifting her chin slightly. Keanu recognized that look. It was the same one she'd given students who tried to take shortcuts on assignments. He knew pushing harder right now would only make her pull away. "I understand," he said gently, "but you helped shape who I am. At least let me buy you dinner tonight, for old time's sake." That evening, over soup and sandwiches at a quiet corner restaurant, Keanu listened more than he spoke. Mrs. Harrison talked about her 40 years of teaching, her late husband's love of music, and the children at the community center. Not once did she complain about her situation. Back in his hotel room, Keanu couldn't sleep. Images of the leaking ceiling and cold apartment kept him awake. At 3 a.m., he called his longtime friend and financial advisor, Tom. "I need to set something up," Keanu explained. "Something important, but it has to be handled carefully." Over the next week, while telling Mrs. Harrison he was busy with film festival events, Keanu put his plan into action. He met with real estate agents, lawyers, and financial experts. Each meeting ended with signed confidentiality agreements. "My client wishes to remain anonymous," his lawyer explained to the others. "This is non-negotiable." Keanu personally visited 12 houses before finding the right one, a modest but warm 2-bedroom home 3 blocks from the community center where Mrs. Harrison volunteered. It had a small garden in back and bookshelves built into the living room wall. "We'll need it furnished," he told the real estate agent. "Nothing fancy, just comfortable. And ready in 2 weeks." Next came the foundation. Keanu met with education experts and former teachers to structure it properly. "I want it to help teachers who've fallen through the cracks," he explained, "and support innovative teaching for kids with learning challenges. But it needs to operate quietly, without publicity." His lawyer raised concerns. "You know this will eventually get out. The press always finds these stories." "By then, it won't matter," Keanu replied. "The important thing is giving her dignity now." The medical bills were the easiest part. A single phone call from his business manager and Mrs. Harrison's $43,000 in medical debt disappeared. The hardest part was setting up the monthly stipend. It needed to be enough for her to live comfortably, but not so much that she'd refuse it out of pride. They settled on a sum equivalent to what her teacher's pension should have been, plus a modest adjustment for inflation. "We'll call it a position with the foundation," Tom suggested. "Education consultant. She can help select scholarship recipients and review grant applications. That way, she's earning it." Keanu nodded. "Perfect." 10 days after his visit to Mrs. Harrison's apartment, everything was ready. The house was purchased, furnished, and stocked with groceries. The foundation paperwork was complete. A small office had been set up in the second bedroom of the house, with a computer and phone for foundation business. Only one challenge remained: convincing Mrs. Harrison to accept it all. "She's proud," Keanu told Tom as they drove to her apartment. "She won't take charity." "It's not charity," Tom replied. "She earned this 40 times over with her years of service. You're just making things right." Outside her building, Keanu took a deep breath. In his briefcase were the house keys, foundation documents, and a letter explaining everything. His hands felt sweaty, his heart racing. What if she refused? What if her pride was too strong? The sky opened up and rain began to fall. Keanu thought about the buckets catching water in her apartment, the cold she endured without heat. He thought about the carefully preserved story she'd kept for 30 years and all the children whose lives she had touched. With renewed determination, he stepped through the rain toward her building. "She won't say no," he whispered to himself. "I won't let her." The morning was unusually cold for Toronto in the fall. Frost covered the ground, and people hurried along the sidewalks with hands buried deep in their pockets. Keanu arrived at Mrs. Harrison's apartment building at exactly 9 o'clock as promised. Tom, his financial advisor, stood beside him, holding a leather folder full of documents. "Remember," Keanu said quietly, "let me do the talking first." Mrs. Harrison answered the door wearing the same blue sweater as before, but with a colorful scarf around her neck for extra warmth. Her apartment was even colder than during his last visit. "Keanu, what a nice surprise," she said, eyes curious when she noticed Tom. "And you've brought a friend." "This is Tom," Keanu explained. "He helps me with business matters. May we come in?" She welcomed them, apologizing for the cold. "The landlord says the heating system should be fixed by next week," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. They sat at her small table. Keanu noticed a new leak had developed near the window, with a cooking pot catching the drips. "Mrs. Harrison," Keanu began, "do you remember in 4th grade when you taught us about paying forward kindness?" She smiled. "Of course. We made that kindness chain with paper links. You told us that when someone helps us, we should help others in return," Keanu continued. "That lesson stuck with me all these years." Mrs. Harrison looked at him with growing suspicion. "Keanu, what is this about?" Keanu took a deep breath. "When I was struggling with reading, you stayed after school with me for months. You believed in me when other teachers had given up. You were a bright boy who just needed a different approach," she said simply. "You changed my life," Keanu said, his voice steady and sincere. "You helped me believe in myself. And now I want to pay that forward through you." He nodded to Tom, who opened the folder and placed a house key on the table. "What's this?" Mrs. Harrison asked, not touching it. It's the key to your new home, Keanu said. A small house near the community center where you volunteer. Mrs. Harrison's hand flew to her mouth. I don't understand. Tom slid forward more papers. Mr. Reeves has established the Jennifer Harrison Education Foundation. The foundation owns the house and has hired you as its education consultant. Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened as Tom continued explaining. The position comes with housing, health insurance, and a monthly salary comparable to what your teacher's pension should have been, Tom said. Your medical debts have been cleared, and the foundation is fully funded for the next 50 years. Mrs. Harrison's hands trembled. This is too much. I can't possibly accept. Please, Keanu interrupted gently. The foundation needs someone with your experience. Someone who understands what children need, especially those facing learning challenges. He leaned forward. You won't just be helping yourself. You'll be helping hundreds of kids and teachers. The foundation will provide scholarships and grants. Your expertise is essential to make sure they go to the right people. Mrs. Harrison stood up suddenly and walked to the window, her back to them. Her shoulders shook slightly. Jennifer, Keanu said, using her first name for the first time. You once told me that sometimes we need to let others help us so we can be strong enough to help more people later. Remember? She turned, tears streaming down her face. Those were my husband's words. I told them to you when you were frustrated with reading. Keanu nodded. They helped me then. I hope they'll help you now. For a long moment, she stood silently, looking at the key on the table. Then she walked over and picked it up, holding it like it might break. I still can't believe this is happening, she whispered. Would you like to see the house? Keanu asked. An hour later, they stood in the living room of a modest but beautiful home with large windows that filled the space with light. Mrs. Harrison walked slowly from room to room, touching the bookshelves, running her hand along the kitchen counter, looking out at the small garden. In the second bedroom, set up as an office, she paused at the desk where a framed photo stood, her fourth-grade class from all those years ago, with young Keanu in the front row. How did you find this? She asked, voice breaking. School archives, Keanu said. It's where everything started. Mrs. Harrison turned to him, eyes shining. I don't know how to thank you. Keanu smiled. You already did, 30 years ago. 3 months passed. Winter snow blanketed Toronto, but inside her new home, Mrs. Harrison was warm. She'd settled into a routine, spending mornings at her foundation office and afternoons at the community center. The foundation work energized her in ways she hadn't expected. On this particular morning, she sat at her desk reviewing applications for the first round of teaching grants. The foundation would support 10 teachers who had innovative approaches for helping children with learning differences. The pile of applications had grown larger than anyone anticipated. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Harrison opened it to find a delivery man holding a large package. Jennifer Harrison, he asked. That's me, she said, signing for the box. Inside was a brand new laptop with a note for foundation video calls. The board meeting is at 3 p.m. Mrs. Harrison smiled. Though Keanu had returned to his life in California, he called weekly for updates on the foundation. Today would be their first formal board meeting, with education experts joining from across the country. At precisely 3 p.m., the laptop chimed. Mrs. Harrison clicked the link, and 5 faces appeared on screen. Keanu was in what looked like a film trailer, his hair longer than when she'd last seen him. Welcome to the first official board meeting of the Jennifer Harrison Education Foundation, he said, smiling. I think we should let our namesake and director explain our mission. Mrs. Harrison had prepared for this. She spoke clearly about their goals, supporting innovative teaching methods, providing scholarships for underprivileged students, and creating safety nets for retired teachers facing financial hardship. We've received 127 grant applications in our first round, she reported proudly. I've narrowed them down to 20 finalists for the board to review. The meeting continued for an hour, with meaningful discussion about the foundation's future. When it ended, only Keanu remained on the call. How are you really doing? He asked. Honestly, I haven't felt this useful in years, Mrs. Harrison admitted. The house is perfect, but the foundation work, that's the real gift, Keanu. Any problems? Reporters asking questions. She shook her head. Not a single one. Your lawyer did an excellent job keeping things quiet. That changed the very next day. Mrs. Harrison was at the community center when a young teacher named Louis rushed in, looking excited. "Mrs. H., you're in the newspaper," he exclaimed, holding up the local paper. Mrs. Harrison's heart sank as she read the headline, "Local Teacher's Life Transformed by Former Student." The article detailed how Keanu Reeves had secretly purchased a home for his former teacher and established a foundation in her name. "How did they find out?" she whispered. The answer came quickly. The article mentioned a scholarship recipient, a young man named Paul who had received the foundation's first college scholarship. Overwhelmed by the gift that would allow him to become a teacher himself, Paul had shared the story with a journalist friend. That evening, Mrs. Harrison's phone rang constantly. Old colleagues, former students, and eventually, reporters all wanted to talk to her. She let most calls go to voicemail. When Keanu called, she answered immediately. "I'm so sorry," she said. "One of our scholarship recipients told the press." "Don't apologize," Keanu replied. "We knew it might happen eventually." "Are you okay?" "I'm hiding in my kitchen," she admitted. "There's a news van outside." Keanu was silent for a moment. "Would you like me to issue a statement asking for privacy?" Mrs. Harrison thought about it, then straightened her shoulders. "No, maybe this happened for a reason." "What do you mean?" "Your kindness could inspire others," she said slowly, an idea forming. "Maybe this story getting out isn't so bad after all." The next morning, after a sleepless night, Mrs. Harrison made a decision. She put on her best sweater, brushed her hair, and walked out to face the small group of reporters gathered on her sidewalk. "I'll answer a few questions," she said calmly. "Not about Keanu, he values his privacy, but about the foundation and what it means for education." A reporter pushed forward. "Is it true that Keanu Reeves bought you this house?" Mrs. Harrison smiled. "What's true is that a former student remembered a lesson about kindness and decided to make a difference. The Jennifer Harrison Education Foundation isn't about me or him. It's about making sure no child is left behind because they learn differently, and no teacher is forgotten after decades of service." The reporters scribbled furiously as Mrs. Harrison continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. For the first time in her life, she found herself in the spotlight and realized she could use it to shine light on issues that truly mattered. The story spread like wildfire. What began as a small article in a Toronto newspaper was picked up by national news, then international media. Despite their efforts to keep the focus on education issues, the headlines all centered on Keanu's generosity. Hollywood star's secret act of kindness. Keanu Reeves rescues teacher who once helped him. Mrs. Harrison's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Old students called to reconnect. Teachers' associations wanted her to speak at events. Talk shows begged for interviews. Through it all, she kept teaching at the community center and running the foundation with quiet determination. 6 weeks after the story broke, Mrs. Harrison received a letter from a famous singer who had grown up in Canada. "My fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Wilson, changed my life too," the letter read. "Thanks to your story, I found her living on a fixed income in Vancouver. I've set up a trust fund for her and donated to your foundation." Similar stories poured in. A basketball player tracked down his high school coach who was struggling after retirement. A best-selling author created a scholarship in honor of her English teacher. A tech billionaire renovated the rundown elementary school where he'd once been the awkward new kid. What began as one act of kindness had sparked a movement. On a bright spring morning, Keanu visited Mrs. Harrison for the first time since the story had gone public. They walked together to the community center, where a surprise awaited. The center's main room had been transformed. New books filled the shelves. Computers lined one wall. A colorful reading corner with comfortable chairs invited children to sit and explore stories. The Remember Your Roots Challenge donations did this, explained the center director. After people heard about the foundation, money started pouring in. "We've received over $2 million from former students wanting to honor teachers who helped them." Mrs. Harrison's hand flew to her mouth. $2 million. The director nodded. "And that's just for our little center. Nationwide, the challenge has raised over $30 million for education programs." Later, sitting in Mrs. Harrison's garden, Keanu seemed embarrassed by all the attention. I never wanted the spotlight, he admitted. I just wanted to help you. Sometimes the right story at the right time changes things, Mrs. Harrison said, pouring tea into mismatched cups. She still couldn't break her habit of thriftiness. People needed a reminder about what matters. What matters? Keanu asked. Remembering those who helped us. Recognizing that success isn't just about our own hard work, it's also about the people who believed in us when we were nobody. She smiled. That's why your story touched so many hearts. Not because you're famous, but because you remembered. A comfortable silence fell between them. From inside the house came the sound of the Foundation's office phone ringing again. Aren't you going to answer that? Keanu asked. Mrs. Harrison shook her head. Not today. I've taken the day off. A day off? You? He grinned. The Mrs. Harrison I remember never took days off. Well, this Mrs. Harrison is learning to balance work and life better. She sipped her tea. I have a lunch date with some of my former colleagues. We're starting a mentoring program for new teachers. As Keanu prepared to leave, Mrs. Harrison walked him to the door. On the mantel in her living room stood several framed photos. One showed her with her late husband. Another was the old class picture with young Keanu. But the newest one caught his eye. A group of beaming young people in graduation caps and gowns. The first Foundation scholarship recipients, Mrs. Harrison explained proudly. All of them going on to become teachers. No photos of me. Keanu joked. Mrs. Harrison laughed. I don't need a photo to remember you, Keanu. I see you in every child who comes to the center struggling to read. I see you in every grant we give to a teacher trying something new. I see you in every scholarship student determined to make a difference. She touched his arm gently. Your kindness didn't just change my life. It's changing countless others now. As Keanu drove away, he noticed a small sign in Mrs. Harrison's front yard that hadn't been there during his last visit. It wasn't flashy or attention-seeking, just a simple wooden plaque carved with words he recognized from his fourth-grade classroom. Be kind. Be brave. Remember those who helped you. Help those who come after.